three disciplinary conversations. First of all, whether or not ethnomusicology is a useful, if not desirable, designation. Secondly, how the study of music might be decentered, if not made meaningfully global, and what that would actually sound like in practice. And third, whether the term music has too much cultural baggage inherited from the 18th and 19th century experience of Western Europe, and should it be set aside in favor of alternative heuristics, which would be more inclusive of a broader range of sound arts, performance, and expressive practices. But I'm not going to do that. So today's paper is far less ambitious. I hope to open up some of the concerns I have about the place of South Asia in music studies today. Next slide, please. My title refers to the perhaps strange reality that scholars of early modern Indian music usually teach courses on Bollywood. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I do it too. I also teach K-pop. But I think we should reflect on how we've got here. In particular, the obvious reason for why this happens is not encouraging. South Asian early modern music is considered niche in ways that Western historical musicology is often not. So there is an expectation that if you work on this, you should also have something else, something more popular to bring to the table. And I think that's something we all need to think about. So in what follows, I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, I'm going to discuss some of the current trends that I see in work on music history in the South Asian context. So in effect, it's going to be a very speedy literature review. I'm going to do a lot of name dropping. I'm not going to mention everyone, so apologies if you or your friends are not here. I couldn't fit them all on the slide. Then I will reflect briefly on how these trends reach beyond the disciplinary confines of music with a capital M. And finally, I will consider some of the areas that we've been neglecting so far and explore what we might hope for on the road ahead. So where are we at the moment? Well, so South Asian music history has received attention from the global academy, but especially Euro-American and Japanese scholarship for a long time. As we all know, some of the earliest examples of European writings about Asian music were about India. There are many reasons for this, not least the colonial relationship between Britain and India, but also the post-colonial Ravi Shankar effect. Within India too, literature about music and musicians has proliferated in English and Indian languages for a very long time. Over the last quarter of the 20th century, there were, I'd say, four significant areas of research in Indian music history. So the first is what I call the historical side of ethnomusicology. So this was primarily driven by Euro-American scholars and musicians, and also Japanese, I should say, who developed critical histories of the performance practices they had encountered in the field, often challenging the narratives they received from their teachers and consultants. Many of these could be seen as extensions of an anthropological or sociological mindset into the past. So I'm thinking of Daniel Newman's work, for example. And these were often developed around specific instruments or specific genres, i.e. the things that these scholars went out into the field to study and focus on. Secondly, next, please. Scholars in India developed a philological approach to music history, developing significant studies of historical music treatises, manuscript sources, and Sanskrit or Persian musicology. Premlata Sharma was especially influential in this branch, and a number of European and or Euro-trained scholars also became invested in this approach. With some notable exceptions, and I'm thinking of Alan Miner in particular, however, this approach was not favored in the United States, presumably because philology was not considered suitably ethnomusicological. Third, please. Historians writing in Indian languages have also developed rich accounts that focus on musicians' biographies and lineages, and these provide enormous insights into the social life of music, including the emotional dimensions of listening and how styles developed between these individuals and Gharana lineages. So here I've got the cover of Dilip Kumar Mukhopadhyay's book in Bengali on musicians, art musicians, which is a major resource for people who work in Bengali. Next, please. Less common were histories that drew on extensive, deep archival research an exemplary model was set by Dattatreya Balakrishna Kshirssagar, who wrote detailed studies in Hindi on court music in Rajasthan. In the USA, Bonnie Wade, of course, wrote a cultural history of music under the Mughals by engaging closely with visual sources and art historical methods. And these four trends set the stage for the work that we have seen over the past couple of decades, which draw to varying degrees on all of these strands. Next slide, please. Many of these new histories have been invested in the question of how colonial era reform reshaped musical traditions into the so-called classical monoliths that we encounter today. Some histories are more textual, while others are embedded in oral history and ethnography. Several historically informed studies have challenged received narratives about the shaping of musical canons and highlight histories of erasure and exclusion. Some historians encompass very long periods to examine transition and change, including Catherine Butler Schofield, Madhu Trivedi, and Shweta Sachdeva Jha. Catherine Schofield's work on Mughal and colonial North India in particular has cultivated significant new lines of approach, drawing on larger developments, including new historicism, history of emotions, colonial collecting, and the para-colonial. She has inspired many early career scholars, including myself, but also William Rees Hoffman, Aisha Shet, Kirit Singh, Radha Kapuria, and many others, who draw heavily in her model on archival sources, unpublished music treatises in a range of languages, colonial documentation, and in some cases, oral history as well. Sorry, next slide, please. At the same time, scholars across the humanities are engaging with questions relating to sound and music, especially in the model set by a book called Tellings and Texts. So this was Catherine Schofield's collaboration with Francesca Orsini, a professor of Hindi literature, that asked music and literary scholars to listen to texts for traces of performance practices and orality. Meanwhile, Linda Hess, who had worked on the manuscript transmissions of songs as poems, moved in a new direction in her latest book by engaging with musical ethnography and sound studies. For all intents and purposes, she became an accidental ethnomusicologist. And this has since informed studies of scribal transmission that have excavated layers of performativity and the mediation of singers in the manuscript record. So Imre Banga, for example, has been working on that. Although most scholars outside of music departments are still quite hesitant, I'd say, to engage with musical sources or topics, literary scholars have stressed the significance of songbook culture and musical aesthetics in the early modern and colonial periods. The interdisciplinarity, then, of South Asian music history is essential to the research, and this work is not confined to scholars in music departments. In India, most music historians do not work in music departments, but are spread across the humanities and social sciences. In the North Atlantic world, by contrast, a select few of these scholars are based in South Asian studies or history, and the majority teach on music programs, where they are primarily hired and positioned as ethnomusicologists rather than as historians of music. This speaks to the specifically Euro-American logic of the division of the disciplines, which separated music studies from other fields. In the UK, while history departments today might be receptive to scholars working on law or history of science or the environment or architecture or the emotions, they are often quite nervous about hiring someone working on musicology, which must surely belong in a different building. If music departments are going to be the primary platform for this varied, mixed methodology research, do we need to re-examine the essential categories we think with when we discuss the terms for a job search? There is a lot of innovative transdisciplinary research coming out of music departments, but because music has been siloed for so long, outdated assumptions about what we do or can do persist. Sorry, next slide, please. So in this next section, I want to sketch out what we aren't doing and what we could do going forward. Clearly, these are two sides of the same coin, and they reflect the state of an interdiscipline, shaped by the biases and limitations inherited from multiple influences. Firstly, I think we need to find ways to make an institutional home for pre-colonial musical cultures. Most doctoral students gravitate towards the 19th and 20th centuries, i.e. the age of intensified global interactions and colonialism. I work on this period too, and the material is very rich, but there is also a practical consideration here. This material is more accessible than the unpublished manuscripts and archives of the pre-colonial period, and most students are not adequately trained in the requisite languages. There's also an implicit disciplinary bias. Engaging with colonialism appeals to colleagues and search committees who are interested in Europe or the global in a kind of transnational sense, but perhaps not the Mughals or Marathas in their own terms. Simultaneously, due to the ethnographic / presentist orientation of the study of non-Western music, there's a gentle pressure to frame one's research as providing the longer history of present-day practices, which is easier to do for the more recent past. I think this poses significant problems. It encourages us to think in teleological terms about the historical development of the present and leaves out the worlds of music making that do not exist in living practice or cannot be played as a lively audio example in a lecture. As I've written elsewhere, this also dampens the potential of global music history if we are only writing about the periods and topics that our colleagues who work on Europeans might find interesting. There are some superb early career scholars working on significant chapters of scare quotes medieval and scare quotes early modern music history, but will they be considered too niche to be employable? Won't the search committee be left wondering, but what could they teach? Which is, of course, where Bollywood comes in. At present, the number of early modernist South Asianist music historians in permanent employment can be counted on one hand, if not a couple of fingers. Next slide, please. A second area for development is perhaps surprising. Currently, much of the music that might be uncomfortably labeled as religious or folk is ignored in historical research for South Asia. We should have qualms about these terms, but there is ample scope for exploring the music that is associated with these categories in more nuanced ways. Instead, art music systems, however you want to define that, relating to some extent to court music and subsequently so-called classical music, tend to dominate the discussion, foregrounding a small selection of sites and communities. And I suspect this is the influence of the study of Western music creeping across. Next slide, please. These two issues point to the larger possibility of rethinking the study of music beyond the interests and frameworks provided by the Euro-American Academy. Some of the most significant work in the field is highlighting the extent to which our inherited histories of South Asian music are highly selective, curated, and exclusionary. This has led to uncomfortable conversations that interrogate both the colonial and Brahmanical underpinnings of the study of music history. There is still an even larger conversation to be had about music as a conceptual category or a heuristic device. Does the pursuit of something identified with the Anglophone music still make sense? And how far are we continuing to walk uncomfortably in the shoes of the original Orientalists like William Jones? Although I'm writing from a very different political and ideological position, my own work is certainly informed by methodologies and questions that are part of the Jones legacy, including searching for manuscripts, textual study and translations, discussions with consultants and living musicians, and an attention to affect and the epistemology of art music, all of which you can see in his work. Yet, I'm also conscious that my research is now cultivated as part of a conversation between ethnomusicology, Western music history, and South Asian history, with each field bringing its own priorities and blind spots. Working across these disciplines has the potential to highlight shortcomings and opportunities. So in this very short overview, I've highlighted some trends and possibilities. While there are particular features that are specific to South Asian music history, I think many of these issues speak to much larger dynamics in the humanities. To return to my title, there's no harm in teaching Bollywood as a Mughal historian, or Enka as a historian of early modern Japanese music, and so on. Of course, there is a risk that a scholar's expertise is being underused or even undervalued. Speaking from the perspective of someone working in a deeply flawed UK higher education environment, I'd suggest that we need to be pragmatic and that everyone in music will need to diversify and teach outside of their comfort zones. That labour should not be borne by scholars of non-Western music history alone. It should also be recognised that non-Western music doesn't always mean ethnomusicology. Although I'm sometimes skeptical about the growth of so-called global music history, I do hope that it encourages imaginative, open-minded hiring practices. An underlying concern here is how can we future-proof the growth of regional music histories? Given that music departments in the UK are often underfunded or undervalued, is there really space to develop programs that include musical training, historical methodologies, languages, and area expertise? This will require a pragmatic balance between interdisciplinarity and the safeguarding of music programs. In the case of SOAS, we have had to significantly reduce our undergraduate offering in music. And while that was a painful choice, I take hope from our students who take the joint degree we offer, i.e. BA Music in Japanese or Music in Korean. I think these students will be well equipped to engage in Asian musical histories one day. However, we have an unusual curriculum and a certain flexibility because we don't offer any Western art music at all, although our students can go across to King's College London and do some there if they choose to. I think all departments will need to critically examine what we consider vital to the integrity of the discipline, so many scare quotes, and whether preserving that integrity has significant value moving forward. To end on a more positive and utopian note, I suspect the best way to future-proof growth areas that are still uncomfortably considered niche is to invest in spaces of shared training and research that exist outside or across institutions. So to give one example, my own training in classical Hindi, or Braj, began on a master's course, but was nurtured through a series of summer reading workshops, usually based, bizarrely, in Central Europe. Affectionately known as Braj Camp, these workshops consist of a 2-week book club where readers ranging from master's students to retired professors work together through challenging early modern texts. Readers come from about 15 countries and are relieved to find someone else they can talk to. Before COVID, the number of participants had grown to around 35. We moved online from 2020 onwards, which allowed us to grow our numbers to around 90, with many of these participating as auditors. The move online has really helped us to expand our presence among Indian scholars, students, literature lovers, and other readers, and has created a healthy research community. I think this variety of relatively informal, largely non-hierarchical workshop will be where specialist training and research skills are generated. Yet this will require a very different approach to the competitive knowledge as product logic of the market-driven university, one that exists across disciplines and departments. And we will need to think creatively about how our labors in collaborative extracurricular research culture can be recognized and supported. Thank you.
I have one, especially in relation to the previous talk as well. Do you think, I'm really inspired by your point about what does it mean to think of a curriculum outside the music label? Do you think that there has to be some sort of required, right, course to equip the students to begin to even think that way, or to be able to question?
Right.
Framework in which these books.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, that was such a good point, I think, that that we heard in that last paper, right? Actually, sometimes students just don't want that, which is intriguing. I mean, with so I did my PhD at King's, which is a very interesting department because you've got a nice mix, a nice split of different disciplines and so on. And undergraduates there, I felt in their first year, they had that sort of crisis moment of thinking, oh, I'm not the best violinist I know anymore. What else can I do? And I think King's has done a very good job of trying to strike a balance in their curriculum between things. It sounds similar to what's happening at the moment in Boston. So that's really encouraging. I mean, with SOAS, it's a bit different because our students are self-selecting. So they've chosen to study at a place where they won't do any Western art music. But what happens with that, particularly at master's level, is a requirement to actually specify, okay, so what are we doing then? And I think also to give them a very tangible sense of why the music label might not cover everything. I mean, with us, it's quite obvious because in most courses we'll say, our regional courses will say, technically, this isn't considered music in the region, and it would be inappropriate if you called it music. So what else can we call it? And yeah, it's actually quite common sense from that point of view. but they need to be shown those case studies, I think, and given kind of tangible reasons for thinking outside of it. I think I can imagine that a student who is invested in Western art music for good reasons will come to it and say, well, but so what? And I think that was what I was hearing a bit in that first paper.
Okay. Hi. That was really great. Thank you. I guess I was curious to hear more about your kind of opening slide about who's not going to say, and you kind of got into the whole the thing called music.
Yes.
And I really love your framing of saying, you know, despite our critiques of these early scholars, essentially we still do the same kind of thing in search of music. So I guess I'm just curious to hear more. Because I kind of thought maybe you were thinking with there was the idea that is that music and that music given the same, you know, kind of the early music and the Bollywood. Is there some inappropriate work being done by calling both the same?
So I mean, it may be a slightly UK problem. So we don't have the tenure system with the review. Instead, we have an audit for everyone that comes through every 5 or 6 years. It's called the Research Excellence Framework, and we all hate it. But one of the the REF. Yes, so if you go up to any UK academic and say, how's the REF going? You know, we have one for teaching too. But with that, the idea is that everyone in the department, whatever their level, will submit a few research outputs every 5 years. So it's, but then they have to demonstrate impact and so on and so on. What happens with that is you submit to a panel of other academics from across the university who will sit on the panel for, say, performing arts and media. And so they will evaluate the academic weight of your writings and all projects and so on. So the problem is you need to hope that they have the same definition of music and sound research that you do, right? And so, you know, with my own work, which often does spill outside of kind of the music category, I have to always make sure that I've got articles that someone can definitely look at and say, yes, it's definitely music, capital M. So there's that. I think it also happens at research funding level. I mean, it's a challenge where someone will come up. I have colleagues in my department who are coming up with such amazing, properly interdisciplinary things, engaging hard sciences with musicology and various other things. But I think when they go up to the selection panels who are reviewing their grant proposal, they don't get it. And they're thinking, why is this happening in a music department? This doesn't sound very musical. And then they will invite specialists who, again, will say, what's this? You're talking about a bird. Right. And so again, yesterday there was a lot of conversation about gatekeeping the discipline and boundaries and enclosures and all of this. And it's not just happening within the university departments or peer review, it's also happening in the UK at government audit level and at who gets the research grant. So I suppose it was coming with that. I mean, there are lots I can see in the experience of South Asian music history. There are lots of really interesting forms of performance that quite early on weren't considered musical enough to be considered music, but were considered too performative to be considered literature, and so have just been ignored and are now endangered. So yeah, it's things like that I'm thinking of quite a lot. Yeah.
Yes, okay. I'm wondering what you think about language training between ethnomusicology and musicology, because on the one hand we have the wonderful model of SOAS, and the Orientalists, right? The area studies. We get, you know, short. We don't really like to like them now, but because of FLAS in the U.S., because of SOAS, we have the language training, not national languages, but individual languages, scripts, etc. So on the one hand, you have the ability to do this because you live in a place where this is valued, and so it's kind of special in that way. I'm thinking of a Western musicology curriculum, and I'm thinking of it in the 70s, when even ethnomusicologists sometimes will talk about having to show that they can do German and French, right? I was talking to Jocelyn Diobeau not too long ago about how she made this change where Creole French was recognized as French. So it was able to be recognized as a research language, which is important to her. But there was all of those requirements. My question is, when our historical musicology curriculum is going to expand to require a non-Western language or archival language to be part of their parameters. I could imagine, for instance, one that connects to an area that they might be studying, or maybe just like German was to ethnomusicologists, something that basically buys you admission into this larger conversation that shows your erudition in something outside of Western. We almost can't imagine that, but I can't imagine how this type of work that proceeds through engagement with vernacular archives, in other words, archives that do not privilege the point of contact or do not privilege colonial sources that need to be read, askew. I can't imagine that this is really going to have any steam for it unless we have the ability to ask our students to do this research and to empower them to do the research at all levels. So I wonder what you think about that, about the language training. That like you're probably one of the best trained language people that I know, knowing multiple archival languages, but not everybody.
But it wasn't by a music program,
Right. So
and so that's the thing. Thank you. A lot of the time, at least in the UK system, it's often too late. And that's the problem, because by the time the students figured out which region they want to work on, they start learning and they haven't really had language training before. And so they really struggle. And then I think a lot of the time the pressure does go on heritage speakers and say, oh, well, you better do it because you know how to this language. And that's unfair. And I was thinking of Amanda's paper yesterday where she was saying, it shouldn't be pigeonholed in this way. I mean, in the States, you have amazing resources, right? I mean, the American Institute of Indian Studies has these colossal language programs, which are the envy of everyone else, where in the middle of your doctoral program, you can press pause and go off and do a year of funded language training in India, or 2 if you want. So yeah, I mean, people who do South Asian studies are very envious of the programs in the States because of those resources. But again, how many music programs are aware of that? Are they building it in? Could there be space in master's or graduate training to say, actually, yeah, you can press pause and go do a year of language training, etc.? How would that work? I don't know. I suppose part of the issue, I love the word require. When will it be a requirement of the program to do a non-Western language, which is lovely. Exactly. I mean, I suppose, and this has been done for other subjects, right? So, my first degree was theology, where it was like, right, you do either Greek or Hebrew. And then a lot of theology departments said, oh, actually, there are others. So you can also choose to do Arabic or Pali or Sanskrit. So again, that has been happening, and there are problems with that selection of languages. I suppose for music, the pushback would be, well, we know that if you know French or German, you can cover a lot of different material that interests us. So how do you know in year 1 that you want to do Malay as opposed to Thai, etc.? But I think that's a silly response, because ultimately there are lots of languages that can help you cover huge swathes of material and will be there in the background when you learn something else more relevant to your area. So if they said, yeah, let's have Persian, Arabic, either classical or modern Chinese, etc., right? For starters, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.